members of these message boards essentially engage in lots of discussion. They post pictures, they debunk, or they try to find explanations or evidence to say, oh, that's just a drone. You know, this could be anything, or hey, maybe there is something here. They also share other videos and information regarding everything from, hypothetical stuff, documentaries, a little less Ancient Aliens, a little more, podcasty type stuff. So what did we collect? We collected a number of things, items involving global citizenship, identity, aspects of how much media do they consume, whether or not they've actually had personal experiences. And we also have a lot of open-ended questions that we're still working through that ask them things like, when did you become interested in UFOs? Have you ever had an experience? And then also to describe an alien or these unidentified objects. So what did we find? So we asked these questions about identity, about media exposure, about global citizenship, because ultimately we want to see, can we predict some aspects of these global citizenship antecedents and outcomes? So that normative environment, global awareness, and then those 6 outcomes. Can we predict this based on information concerning interest in space, media exposure, interest in UFOs? So what did we find? So in looking at 216 participants from Roswell and a number of UFO message boards, examining the sources of their influence, a global citizenship questionnaire, we found a number of results. And I'll try to explain this the best as possible. We essentially found that some direct relationships exist. In relation to the larger model, we find that interest in space exploration and UFO-related media were predictors for the global citizenship model. However, the search for extraterrestrials and other people within their community were not. And so, again, what this does is it sort of paints a picture that interest in space and engagement with the media effectively, predicts or aids in this prediction of this global citizenship model. However, extraterrestrials do not. And so again, it creates that further divide between this interest in space and UFOs and that extraterrestrial hypothesis. That kind of makes sense because a lot of these message boards and communities aren't interested in discussing it. They're more interested in the unidentified objects, which could be a drone, which could be a military aircraft, and not the ETs. And what is kind of interesting, though, is that while it does predict normative environment, others in the community don't really offer a prediction for global awareness. So that's something that we're looking into in another paper, that the community itself isn't the same as we would see in a lot of other groups. So we then moved to replicate this with a student sample. So we wanted to see, all right, we see media and interest in space exploration as a big push for this. Can we actually see a replication of the same model with a non-UFO interested sample, just for the average person, who's maybe not, sifting through message boards looking for UFOs or talk about UFOs? Could the average person have an effect? So we collected data. One of my colleagues collected data at Texas A&M Commerce, 416 undergraduate students. And again, we find very similar results. The correlations were very similar in predicting the antecedents and the outcomes. And then we also see that this general interest in space and media consumption as a predictor for or increasing the likelihood of this global citizenship model. In this case, a little more on the global awareness. The normative environment kind of makes sense, as the students aren't kind of an official group. They're all at the same school, but they're not a group in the same way that we might see them with like a UFO message board or attendees at Roswell. So what do we get from this? I mean, despite all of the charts, kind of what does this mean? One, we ultimately found that UFO enthusiasts are not all that different from a non-UFO enthusiast group. It's not saying that students can't be UFO enthusiasts, but a comparative sample shows very similar results. And so that this interest in space is sort of further normalized, as it were. That part of our argument that early research in psychology viewing things like abductions and UFOs and interests in aliens and spacecraft was tied to more maladaptive or non-normative factors. What it may be is that because the media is so salient, is because it's so out there in our community, it's so easy to find UFO-related media that people interested in it, again, it is more of an interest than a kind of hardline belief. Now, this might be very different if we looked at individuals specifically who had reported direct experience or had reported abductions, but we would likely argue that that interest is what's kind of driving this global citizenship model. We find that out of everything that we looked at, interest in space and space exploration seems to be a very good predictor, while some of the other outcomes are not as consistent. So we were able to show in study one how global citizenship could be examined in a novel group tied to these interests in space exploration and technology. That there are some of the outcomes that aren't as robust in the model. And so for instance, while we might see kind of a higher degree of global awareness, which does lead to global citizenship, which does lead to, I'll kind of jump back real quick to that model. You might see some higher intergroup empathy, intergroup helping. We sometimes see a disconnect in some of those. And a lot of that has to do with the group. At least that's what we're positing right now, is that because the group isn't as cohesive, there are a lot of subgroups within the UFO enthusiast community. Some are all in on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Some are all in on just focusing on like military investigation of unidentified aerial phenomenon. Some of those outcomes aren't as consistent, and they're not as consistent when we examine them to the student sample. But ultimately, we find that global citizenship has been seen and seen to be boosted in this novel group focused on, like I said, space exploration and technology. And this research further aligns with combined studies in both global citizenship identity in relation to social identity theory, where individuals in communities of shared interest, we've looked at this in fan communities and other community samples, and how even outside of group membership, association with those interests leads to greater influences from the interest itself. Study two, as well as previous research on the topic, shows that one's sense of connection in a shared community, so students as part of a kind of a shared community at a university, and how these communities may lead to greater global thinking, and in this case through interest in space. You're bringing that salience, you're bringing that abstract identity to a higher level, human as opposed to American, as opposed to New Mexican, as opposed to Highlands alumni or student. So there are some definite limitations. The correlational nature of this study does make it difficult to causally state a level of interest or influence in an interest of space. We would like to go further. We were hoping to go back to Roswell this year, but due to circumstances, that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to go engage with a lot of people in July in Roswell, New Mexico, amidst the pandemic. But we want to look at the further exploration of experimental study, doing something like priming space exploration. We can actually do this in a survey. And then also things like priming things like mysteries beyond our sphere. So getting people to think about the possibility of extraterrestrial engagement, having them read quotes from people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Stephen Hawking, who posit that due to the vastness of the universe, there's likely probably something out there. That could also prime a higher level of global awareness and thus more global citizenship identity. Let's see. So one of the things that we did notice, and one of the other limitations that we had, is that, or at least one of the kind of interesting findings that we want to explore more, is that within study one, within the online UFO communities, there is kind of a break between previous examinations or examinations between the community itself and some of the outcomes, specifically outcomes like the pro-social values. The identity amongst the community itself is not as strong as we would find. We're kind of arguing that they're a group that's not a group, or at least they're a group of a collective of smaller groups of people with an overarching shared interest, but these subtle variations in where their interest is focused. So some are interested in aliens, some are interested more in, you know, kind of traditional UFO aspects. Some are interested in just sharing images of what might be UFOs. Some are more interested in the debunking side or the military investigation side of it. And so, again, that this leads to some limitations with the data that we've collected in terms that they are smaller groups or very specific groups. So we definitely need to expand this. Ideally, future research would boost recruitment through more engagement with attendees at conventions, conferences, UFO-related festivals, and to broaden our involvement in online message boards outside of Reddit. Above all other limitations, though, improving our sample size would ultimately benefit as well. So this is our team, myself and a number of other researchers at Texas A&M Commerce, Bishop's University in Alberta, Canada, Transylvania University, which is in Kentucky, not in Eastern Europe. But they've all kind of contributed in a number of ways, mainly Dr. Ryson and Kadzarska Miller on their global citizenship work, Dr. Henley and his work on history of psychology and looking at a lot of the past research, and then myself, Thomas Brooks, and Courtney Plant doing engagement with collection of data and a lot of the fan research that we tie into global citizenship. So, all right. I think that kind of covers most of it, or at least a very brief overview without getting maybe too technical outside of some heavy charts.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions. I had someone email me earlier, so I'm going to post that question in the chat for you, Daniel. This was from Paul.
Any more common? Yeah, that would be a really good question to ask the UFO community. I got a pretty big crash course on a lot involving UFOs, and I've been delving kind of more and more down those rabbit holes. I'm really interested in kind of that side of things. I'm not entirely sure. I know, kind of the general sense of some of the kind of core aspects of UFO sightings, some of the trends. It's definitely possible. I mean, I know with Roswell, it was there's also the crash happened a little closer to some other areas, so that there's a farm nearby. There, again, like how where they're happening. I'm trying to think specifically if I can remember any major events, especially around like nuclear bomb testing sites and whatnot. I mean, that is one of the, I guess, I want to say theories, but one of the hypotheses regarding that these UFO sightings really started, or at least started gaining a lot of traction about the time we started doing testing. And so if you're interested in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that we have aliens or some force or some group that's kind of reaching out to us, the kind of conspiratorial view would be that may have been one of those turning points, that we were not really that interesting of a species until we started, testing the A-bomb. We don't really have any data to support that because we haven't, captured an alien yet, or had some very definitive evidence of extraterrestrial involvement. But I know that it's pretty widespread, even outside of like nuclear bomb sites. That there are a lot of places that report it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on right now in Colorado. It does seem to be drones. At least that's current hypothesis right now, but there are a lot of interesting lights. I mean, there's the Phoenix lights, which is, I think they've noted, and I mean, some people would disagree, but they've noted were like signal flares or flares coming off of aircraft. But that also doesn't get into the new stuff that the military's finally kind of opened up about concerning UAPs, or at least that's what they're designating it. And they're saying, look, we're not saying it's aliens, but there's definitely something that these pilots saw. We have a recording, and it moves very oddly. So we don't know what it is. And so technically it is an unidentified, or they would call it aerial phenomenon.
If anybody else has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or type them in the chat. Daniel, we have a comment from Dennis here. He says, thanks for coming to Roswell. He says, come back, the city believes.
I definitely want to. Yeah, we want to do a lot more engagement and a lot more talking with the community. I think if we would have set up a little less by the more fairy side and of the festival, and a little where all the talks were going on, we would have probably gotten a lot more interesting data. And if we would have had a bigger team with us, we would have been able to kind of spread out and do a lot more interviews, collected a lot more qualitative research. But ultimately, I mean, I think what we noted and that what we found in this research is that it shouldn't be viewed as a stigmatized association. You know, people say, oh, these people see aliens, they must be crazy, there must be something wrong with them. No, we should look at this as a potential positive, that this interest is not only so heavily involved in the media that we consume and the kind of popular consciousness. That's actually part of where we're looking to get this this published, is in like psychology of media, because it's heavily tied to the media that we consume, the discussions that we're having in groups, is that it's not this kind of stigmatized conspiracy theories in the shadows. It's something that people have a conversation about, and what we noted, it does have the potential to influence them in positive ways. Thinking about yourself at a higher degree of group identification ultimately makes you see more people as part of your in-group, and it adds to some level of inclusiveness. Interesting thinking about with Roswell that whether that with that salience there, you know, could we compare Roswell to another community and see maybe a higher level of like global citizenship awareness, a higher level of that salience? I don't know. Might be interesting.
Any other questions? Oh, we've got another question in the chat from Joaquin. Do you think the U.S. government will be more open about UFO sightings and declassify everything about them?
Probably not. I mean, due to the nature, like you always have people who are coming out. I remember there was a lot of discussion in some of these forums, and even going back to like 2016, 2017, because there were a lot of people who were really hopeful that like Trump was going to release all of this information. Like he said he would, he's going to do it. And then all of a sudden he's like just completely, you know, shut down and stopped talking about it. And so the conspiracy theory is that they told him the truth, and he's like, well, we can't let the people know about this. I mean, it's likely that we'll start hearing stuff over time. I mean, if we're talking about this in terms of a military sense, this is probably something that is tied to experimental aircraft or information that's out there. And so, you know, if you're still working on some aspects of that, if it's really experimental, that's not something that the military is going to be upfront about until it's already kind of widely known. There are some interesting stuff regarding, you know, some of the stuff that has been released with what's the Blink 182 lead singer, Tom DeLonge, that he he's kind of started a foundation that's asking people to submit stuff, and they're going to investigate it. He's trying to work with the military, and then actually because of the stuff that he leaked, they actually came out and said, all right, yeah, we did see something. These are legitimate. These are actual footage from, you know, Navy pilots. There's definitely something out there. We're not saying it's aliens, but it's definitely an unidentified object. because we don't know what it is, or we're not going to tell you what it is. So right now it's unidentified.
We have another question from Louisa. Hi, Louisa. It says, if you had unlimited funding, how would you expand the study for the future?
A lot of cross-cultural research. I mean, that's just something I've always been interested in, and it's very difficult in some cases to expand because, I mean, how we view, especially if this is a media aspect, especially, or at least something in the public consciousness, we might see differences depending on differences in how people engage with their understanding of UFOs and whatnot, and then also to collect data from more places. So not just like say the Roswell Festival, but to also go there's a big one in Dallas. They have kind of a convention. I think it's Alien Con or something like that, but it's almost like a fan convention for people interested in aliens and UFOs. So going somewhere like that, but also just trying to collect data from kind of your average individual, like not looking for like very kind of niche groups or festivals that are going to bring people in who are just interested in this, but kind of looking at how the average person interacts with their kind of understanding of this, their interests with this. There is a project that I'm starting to work on with some graduate students, some colleagues, where we're going to kind of take the basic idea of this research, but also look at how communities engage with like local folklore. So like the stories they tell, the local remedies, the thing your grandma or grandpa said, like, this is the way we cure this, but also things like haunted places and other things like cryptids. So how a community that's all big on swamp ape differs from chupacabra or La Llorona, that these different stories, how they spread, how they're told, their kind of purpose or message and things like that, to delve a little more into kind of the anthropology and sociology, but also tied into maybe what drives some of this. I'm really interested in sense of community as a part of what brings people together and how that affects kind of a shared psychology.
Any other questions or comments? That looks like that's about it. Well, thank you very much. This has been a great talk.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Enjoyed it very much.
It was a lot of fun.
Thanks for coming. And yeah, we've got, I think we've got a few more talks today. So if people want to check them out, but otherwise, great end of the homecoming week.
Yeah, thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Dr. Chadborn.